So today we're going to do what we called Buddhism and the Cosmos. Sounds fairly deep stuff. And indeed it is. Sensei, in this part of the dialogue, really is digging deep. And, of course, one has to understand in that respect that he was doing shakubuku not just to a scholar and an intellectual, which TOYNBEE was, but also to all the scholars and intellectuals and others who read this book. So in that respect, the effect of the dialogue, of course, goes far beyond those two people. And as you remember, as we worked our way through this book, Dr. TOYNBEE has, in fact, consistently come round to the view that a new and great religion is essential to the world if it's to establish stability and peace. And, in fact, you remember at one point, there was a certain sort of not an argument, but a difference of opinion between the two over the matter of establishing world government. And TOYNBEE said that the essential thing was to establish a world government, and then a great religion must appear if peace is to be stabilized. But Sensei pointed out that the first thing was to establish the religion, the great religion, because without the great religion, the world government would never happen, would never be achieved. Without, in other words, although he didn't say it as such, without the human revolution taking place in a large number of people. So in this final section of the book, called The Nature of Life, he begins to go deeper and to find the chance to explain to Dr. TOYNBEE the Buddhist philosophy of life, the mechanics of life, what life is, how life works, and what is death. So this was in terms of his dialogue, this was a very important phase that he reached by this time, in terms of doing shakubuku to Dr. TOYNBEE. And of course, inevitably, therefore, whereas in the first sections of the book, Sensei tended to take a place back and let TOYNBEE lead off in his respect for him as a great scholar. In this section, inevitably, Sensei has to start to take the initiative and be feeding the ideas into TOYNBEE to open his eyes and his mind. And, of course, to open the eyes and minds of everyone who reads this book. And as I said, I think, at one of these sessions earlier on, to me, this last section of the book, which deals purely and simply with the Buddhist view of life, is absolutely brilliant. It's the best explanation that you could find anywhere, I think, in all the books we have on Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism. And it's also comparatively short. In a short number of pages, he conveys an unbelievable amount of depth. So I feel, we've got to get this book published in a proper manner, as we've also said before. We have to do it in the next 3 or 4 years. When I met Sensei's son, his eldest son, Hiromasa, in Paris just recently on the 3rd of May, he said himself, during the course of a conversation, that he felt that this book, would become more and more important and be more and more widely read as time passes. But we've got to get it, into the hands of the people in order to read it. So we've got to tackle this one very strongly in the near future. So, just like TOYNBEE, really, Buddhism, even though a person doesn't practice it, can give them a totally new view of life. There's no doubt about that. Even if their karma won't permit them to practice for some reason, it can change their view of life. And even one Buddhist principle, if it's understood, can bring about a change. A different way a person views life, a different dimension, if you like, from the way they've been used to using it. So it's crucially important that these books get out and about. And it seems so sad that it's not got out and about, this particular book, written by Sensei and one of the great British scholars, strangely enough. So it must be nothing else but Sanshashima, mustn't it? Extraordinary thing. So we got to win this battle and get it out. Anyway, we're taking the first step, as you know, by producing this book as an introduction of Buddhism. And I hope that in the flow of books that follow, Choose Life will be one of the first. So first of all, these two tackle the subject of the origin of life. And Toynbee, with his clear mind, says that there can only be two possible ways that life originated. One is from some sort of almost magical creative act on the part of some being, whether mythical or not, but nevertheless that is one possible explanation. And the other is evolution. And Sensei, of course, says that it must be evolution because of Buddhism's understanding of the existence of the law of cause and effect. Evolution is cause and effect, isn't it? And this is the way, of course, life must have begun. And he starts off, or fairly early on, to explain the first of a number of Buddhist principles. That is to say, the first one is the three truths. Santai, you all know it, Keitai, Kutai, and Chutai. The three truths which collectively is called in Japanese Santai. So also, on your paper that you were given when you came in, the first diagram, A1, helps one to understand that. Interestingly, of course, too, it was Santai, the three truths, which was the revelation in Sensei's poem addressed to the UK. And here again, in talking to Toynbee, this is the first principle that Sensei talks about in any great depth in this book. So Sensei's feeling that this principle of the three truths, or the middle way, is incredibly important, he must feel, for the British people, for them to help them to understand Buddhism, and that it will appeal to the British mind, must be his reason for emphasizing it in this way. So it's as well we all understand it and make sure that we are able to explain it and use it whenever possible. So as you well know, those three truths, Kutai, is what Mr. Toda struggled with when he was in prison. To understand Kutai, that is to say, in English, if you like, neither existence nor non-existence. Some civil servant at one time, I remember, it must have been in the 1950s, but he invented a term called suspended animation. This was the term that they used for people who had been temporarily sort of put away into a sort of reserve until they were called forth again in the services in the event of war. And this civil servant, I don't know who it was, invented this expression. People who were in suspended animation. But in a way, it's not a bad term for the state of for Kutai. That is to say, it's neither existence nor non-existence. Those people were not soldiers or sailors or airmen who were in suspended animation, but at the same time they were. So, of course, neither existence nor non-existence means that we cannot measure the Buddhist theory of life, and specifically of the three truths, in terms of time and space. It's beyond time and space. And in prison, Mr. Toda, you remember, struggled with those 34 negatives which appear in the Lotus Sutra, and he couldn't think what it meant. First of all, he didn't particularly want to read the Lotus Sutra, if you remember. He asked for a book, and they brought him the Lotus Sutra, and he sent it back again. I guess he felt Lotus Sutra was too heavy stuff to read in prison, and he came back again. He kept on coming back, and he kept on giving it back, and it came back again, until he realized in the end there must be some meaning in this strange happening, that the jailers always brought him the Lotus Sutra to read. And in the end he started to read and study. And he got stuck at this matter of the 34 negatives. A whole list of negatives, neither square nor round, nor standing up, nor sitting down, nor fat, nor thin, nor moving, nor stationary, and so on. And he thought, what on earth is this all about, these extraordinary negatives, you see? And he chanted 10,000 Daimoku a day in order to try to understand it. And you remember he used a piece of string and milk bottle tops for his juzu. And solemnly every day he would chant 10,000 Daimoku to try to understand what this 34 negatives meant. Until in the end, one day, this great moment came when he realized, of course, it's life. Life, which is neither standing up nor sitting down, neither existence nor non-existence. And the entire universe, he realized, was ku, was this state of ku, basically. And that it was filled with a myriad entities, phenomena as we call it, sort of floating about, really, in a sense, in this great sea of nothingness, which wasn't actually nothingness, because out of that sea, in an incredible way, all these phenomena appeared. And he realized, this must be the nature of life. That life is constantly passing through this process of non-existence and existence and back to non-existence. And that also leads, of course, to the understanding that life, or the entities of life from which these phenomena manifest themselves, can always renew itself. That the universe has existed forever. It's no good asking, how did the universe begin? Because the universe is built in to renew itself. The universe always has been and always will be, ever since time without beginning and unto time without ending. So this is life. It's a mystery, of course, a mystery of life. It's endlessly existing and at the same time endlessly renewing itself. So you've heard me before use the example of the lizard's tail. I always liked this business of the lizard's tail. It fascinates me, that if you tread on a lizard's tail, he leaves it behind under your shoe. Or if he catches it in a door, he leaves it in the door and carries on. But in due course of time, he grows a lizard's tail again, in absolute perfection. He doesn't grow a crocodile's tail or a monkey's tail. He grows a lizard's tail. That's incredible. Even the lizard's tail is able to renew itself. Unfortunately, if we lose a leg, we don't have that particular ability that the lizard has, but for some extraordinary reason of evolution, he's able to renew his tail. So this is an extraordinary thing. But what is it? This is the important point. What is it that gives life this momentum? That's the important point, isn't it? This rhythm or the momentum of constant renewal. And of course the answer is in the three truths. You have Ketai, the physical aspect of life. You have Kutai, the spiritual aspect, the unseen aspect. And you have this power or rhythm of life, which we call Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, which harmonizes ku and ke, binds the two together, and enables life to manifest itself and to live on until its time comes to disappear again back into that unseen state. So it's quite natural from that understanding that Sensei moved forward into the matter of the eternity of life. So the cycle of life and death again is shown on the diagram A2. It's very simple in a sense, but it's also very amazing. And of course, all that part of the circle which is below that horizontal black line in the middle is that unseen state where renewal takes place. Some philosophers have got near it. They've used, in struggling to understand the meaning of life, they've used, for example, the term the very ground of life. The very ground of life, at its absolute basic, where things grow. But Buddhism goes that further to point out that it's not like a static thing. You pass through this period of renewal, which we call death. When enough life force is generated to give birth and come up the other side of the circle again. Everything incessantly renewing itself. But the Christian teaching is very different from that. Just to remind you, the Christian idea was that a sort of spirit or soul was resurrected after death at some point, like a sort of ghost. And there was an other world, or heaven, also hell, but a heaven, where these spirits, or ghostly mirrors of our living lives, were able to live in great joy and happiness for the rest of their time. That's very interesting because it has come about as a result of their basic starting point of Christianity, so far as human beings is concerned, which is that they're the one of original sin, going back to Adam and Eve and all that. And they disobeyed the voice of God, and therefore all humankind from that time onward inherited a sinful state, basically, from Adam and Eve. So, in other words, if there is original sin, therefore heaven or paradise cannot be a place where the flesh or the physical self exists. Do you see what I mean? It was the physical selves of Adam and Eve, right? And their desires which caused them to disobey God. So therefore, in the explanation of redemption, that is taken into account. It is not possible to imagine that heaven can be on this earth, that you can be reborn in a perfectly physical form, in a godly state, in other words. So therefore, the flesh is always impure in Christianity, and therefore their idea of heaven was of a world of spirit only. Do you follow what I'm getting at? So Christ, therefore, also is the only Son of God. There isn't even a daughter of God. He's the only Son of God because of this problem of original sin. So Christ redeemed himself and every other human being, so the story goes, by suffering and dying on the cross for the sake of all mankind. But even so, even though he did that, one can't be born again as a son of God. If you were Christians, you're not the sons of God, Or if you're women, you're not the daughters of God. There is only one, and that is Jesus Christ. So this is all to do with this problem of the starting point of Christianity, which is original sin. But Buddhism has nothing to do with that at all, of course. So sometimes when we do shakabuku, people say, oh, it's just like Christianity, isn't it? And, maybe because you're doing shakabuku, you say, well, there are some, similarities. But in fact, there aren't at all when you get down to basics. So there is no such thing as self-sacrifice in Buddhism. And of course, when you view Christianity from the aspect of Buddhism, you then see how much that teaching has given birth to guilt in human beings. The guilt actually, although it sounds strange, arising from that original sin. I'm not saying people these days think about Adam and Eve or even relate themselves to Adam and Eve if they're Christians. But the very fact that Christ died on the cross, they can certainly relate to, because they see it in every church they go to. So if your object of devotion is a cross, some of which actually have Christ dying on it with the nails through his hands, what is that going to reflect in human life? Those who devote themselves to it, of course, in unbelievable guilt that someone should go through that appalling suffering in order to save sinful mankind. So this, is where the guilt in the West, which every one of us probably have suffered from, that's where it all arises originally. So Buddhism, on the other hand, teaches that the flesh, or the physical self, is as wonderful and as essential as the spiritual self. That no part of life expressed in humanity or in any other form is bad. But on the other hand, all forms of life, and particularly human beings, have working in them both a negative and a positive force. And furthermore, Buddhism then says, doesn't it, that negative force, even that is vitally important, because the struggle between negative and positive creates the energy which we call life. So what a great difference it is, isn't it? Everything in Buddhism is positive. There is nothing that can create guilt. Everything has a purpose. Even the three evil paths of hell, hunger, and animality, even that has a purpose, because it creates the struggle which activates or generates the dynamism of life. So going from there, if you look at the diagram again, the cycle of life, though Sensei doesn't teach this in any detail in this dialogue to TOYNBEE, but refers to it, the cycle of life is representing that state of renewal. And that's the incredible power of Chutai, or Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. And then TOYNBEE goes on to ask questions about karma. And again, there's another diagram, just to remind you, diagram B2, which explains a little bit karma. And Sensei, indeed, talks about this in some detail. He points out to Dr. TOYNBEE that Buddhism views past, present, and future as one. I'm sure you all understand that completely, that the causes of the past create the present, and the causes of tomorrow and the next day create the future. And that's the only way you can justify the inequalities that we see in life. And in that respect, probably it would be a good thing for me to stop talking for a moment and ask Robert to read the first extract from the book, which is on page 255, the last but one paragraph. Okay, Robert.
IKEDA. You are correct in saying that the inadequacies of our spiritual abilities limit our theories about the universe and about the true nature of life to unverifiable hypotheses. Scientific theories are subject to and must be subjected to theoretical and experimental tests of validity. Ways of evaluating religious hypotheses, however, are different. First, religious hypotheses must be judged on how well they explain the phenomena of life that seem inexplicable to unaided human intelligence. Second, they must be judged on how effective they are in providing a foundation for human judgments and actions. In other words, we must ask whether scientific hypotheses are true, whereas we must ask whether religious hypotheses have value for the improvement of the qualities of humanity. I find the Buddhist hypothesis that life is eternal and constantly changing from one mode to another an effective explanation of the differences in the various fates of human beings born into this world. If we do not posit a former life for a person living in the present, the fate of that person must be ascribed either to an absolute supernatural being or to pure chance. By avoiding a supernatural being governing the actions of man, the Buddhist explanation allows man to realize that he is himself responsible for his fate, and in this way makes possible fundamental independence.
So that really sums up his explanation of the law of cause and effect. And swinging forward, they move on now to the nature of the universe. And here, of course, they agree that the universe is. People always ask a question and answers, how the universe began. The Buddhist answer is the universe is, because of this built-in ability of all things in life, without exception, to renew themselves. So this is where that principle of Kuan Ganja, of course, comes from. Life without beginning and without ending. Is there only one universe? Buddhism would say it's quite possible that there are more than one universe. That there is a universe beyond this one and a universe beyond that. There's no reason why not. If the causes and effects were there, then that's what would happen. And really and truly, they in the end come to the conclusion that when it gets down to brass tacks, human beings, including scientists, really don't know anything more about the universe than the Greeks did, so many thousands of years ago. It's amazing, isn't it, when you see all the technological processes going on around us. But when it comes to the universe, or for that matter, the universe that exists in each one of us, human beings don't know any more. Perhaps they know even less because they've forgotten a lot of the things the Greeks knew and are so big-headed they think the Greeks can't teach them anything. So, of course, they also agree, absolutely, and TOYNBEE joins in, that the idea of a supreme being, is ridiculous, really, naive. And I suppose, as a one-time practicing Christian, I'm not knocking Christianity, as you know, because it did a lot for me in opening up my religious mind. But on the other hand, when you look at Christianity now, having been involved with Buddhism and seen its power at work, it is sort of pathetic, really. I really feel. You go into these absolutely magnificent cathedrals. I can't believe that the people who created those are what they're like now. Great cathedrals filled with, rather sort of, people who lack any life force somehow. Perhaps I'm exaggerating, and I shouldn't say these things, but as it's the New Century group, I am. I don't know. It's a really strange thing. I don't know whether those of you who are of the Jewish faith before find that when you go into what's the word? Synagogues. But I certainly feel it in Christianity. And something sort of, yes, I think pathetic. I don't know how else to say it about it. A lack of oomph. I'm talking, mind you, then about the Church of England. Catholics are different because they had the driving force behind them of superstition and fear. I really encountered. I'm sorry, I'm speaking frankly today. But I went to Ireland last week. It was such a wonderful trip, and the members are doing so well there. But in one place I went to, which was a small village outside of Waterford, where there is a little group now. It's only a tiny group, and they just have one guest. This, incidentally, was the first time I'd been able to go to meetings outside of Dublin. I went to Waterford and to Cork. But the meeting in Waterford was in this little village a bit outside it, and there was one guest, and he was obviously the local rebel. He was an artist, man of about 40, very interesting, very humorous fellow, but he was the local rebel. And really, when he talked about, the way things were and the incredible grip that the Roman Catholic Church still have on the people, especially in the rural areas, which this was, and in these small villages, the priest is unbelievably powerful. He has his tabs on everyone's life. And the reason is, of course, that he knows all about everyone's life. He knows all the gossip. It all comes back to him. Because there is a tendency, because the priest is a priest and he's put on a pedestal, there's a tendency for people to tell him everything that goes on. They go to confession. He learns everything about everyone, not a thing hidden. So no one, really dares go against him. It's like a sort of amazing spiritual blackmail. And I know probably, just funnily enough, the week before I'd watched on the telly Ryan's Daughter, which I'd seen about 3 times. And I've no doubt that is an exaggerated story. It's a very good film. But in many ways, it's not so exaggerated. That was quite apparent from the way this chap was talking. The power of the priest is colossal, but it's all involved in superstition and this fear of the wrath of God, if they do anything which upsets the priest. So, of course, when he's not looking, they do all sorts of things they shouldn't be doing and hope they get away with it. But there's always the fear that someone will tell the priest. And from then on, the priest has got them there. Oh, amazing. Anyway, that is the way Christianity has grown. And of course, it's far removed from the original, quite simple and beautiful teachings of Jesus Christ, which certainly don't cross anything in Buddhism. But that is the way man interpreted it. So the human revolution, becomes more and more important when you see that going on. A religion that hasn't got the power to bring about a human revolution can have such a distorted effect on life. How did I get onto that? What?
About the driving force of attraction.
Yes, that's right. So anyway, having talked about the universe, they then moved on to life on other planets. So Sensei pointed out that in the Lotus Sutra, there is a great deal of talk about life on other planets. And there is a great deal of talk about life on other planets in the Gosho too. Because Nichiren Daishonin talks about all the Buddhas of the universe and from all the Buddhas' lands in the universe. So Buddhism has always accepted the fact that wherever in the universe conditions and circumstances are similar to this planet, then inevitably there will be life on that other planet somewhat similar. So long ago in 1973, Howard Hill asked Sensei, when those early pioneers had their dinner with him at the Waterside Inn in Bray, and Howard Hill, one of the questions he asked was, do you believe that life exists on other planets? And Sensei's answer was yes, that he did. He said, of course, it might look rather different, might not be exactly the same physically as we look, but nevertheless it's bound to exist because of cause and effect, the workings of cause and effect. So therefore anything to do with life beyond life on this planet is of the utmost importance. And I remember I was telling the young women that it's only 3 or 4 years ago, I think, and I think it was the United Nations representative from Barbados who, in some debate by the General Assembly, began to talk about the importance of not dismissing the possibility of the existence of UFOs, unidentifiable flying objects. And all the newspapers really derided this poor man for being such an idiot, as to say such a thing. But I think that's totally wrong. Everyone should be concerned about space. The fact is we don't know anything about it, but it doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't have inquiring minds and that we shouldn't begin to think about our attitude towards anything that comes from space when it does come, or when we encounter it in one way or another. Space is a reality. The existence of other planets is a reality. Buddhism, through the law of cause and effect, points out very clearly that there is bound to be life on other planets where the circumstances are similar to our position in our particular galaxy. So we should be thinking about our attitude towards space and Star Wars and all these things. And above all things, the attitude which man should have towards other men regarding space, and the attitude that we should have towards space men, people who come from outer space. It's not something that's mythical. I'm not saying that it'll happen in your lifetime, but definitely at some point in the future it'll happen. It can't fail to. So some way we will contact or discover life as our ability to probe further and further into the universe grows. It's only 40 years ago, no one had been onto the moon. 30 years ago. Now, goodness knows, they're flying spaceships all over the place, aren't they? But there's a limit to where they can go. But that limit won't stay a limit. Definitely in 100 years' time, we shall be, goodness knows how many light, whatever you measure it in, light miles, out into space. So we cannot dismiss it, and we should never, I believe, deride anyone who is concerned about it. Like that poor man who represented Barbados and opened his newspapers the next day, and everyone was, giggling and chuckling and holding the man's a fool and this. And I think, in that respect, of course, a movie like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, to me, was the most spellbinding movie I've ever seen. I was absolutely spellbound. I couldn't get out of my seat at the end. Mitsuko kept on trying to get me up, and I couldn't move. I wanted to see it all over again. Because to me, it was so very Buddhist. It was the Buddhist view that life can exist, and that when eventually we meet it, we've got to be prepared to do so. And they will be because they can come and visit us, in the case of that movie, they must be of a much higher intelligence in being able to do such a thing. Therefore, the thought of polluting Then, with our filth, with our three poisons, and with all the muck and so, we wade around in the moment is terrible. And Toynbee says, we have to be very cautious about space and our preparation one day to either probe it to where there is life or for someone on the other side to probe us. And that we, in our approach, must be modest, tactful and conciliatory, he says. You've all read Eric, I put the name down here, Eric von Daniken, Chariots of Fire.
The gods.
Well,
Gods.
Chariot of the Gods, that's right. I read 2 or 3 of his books. I certainly wouldn't chuck them aside and laugh at him. I don't think he's got it, but I admire his seeking mind. I don't think his proof probably is real. Well, it isn't real proof that people from outer space at some time visited this earth. I don't think his proof is solid, but I would never laugh at him. I think, that sort of seeking mind is to be admired, because after all, they're thinking about the future. And it is a fact that, for example, things that were written about 50 years ago by H.G. Wells now exist. Everyone thought H.G. Wells, was talking pie in the sky when he predicted this and that and the other would happen. But most of the things he wrote about have happened. Even old Jules Verne in his Round the World in 80 Days or whatever it was, even he's been surpassed. So, of course, there's an awful lot of nonsense in space novels and in space movies, but there are some really good ones, I'm sure you'll agree, where there is a lot of deep thinking. So whatever happens, we mustn't neglect that aspect of life either. And it's important to realize that we are not the only place in this universe where there is life. And the Buddhas have been saying that to everybody for the last 3,000 years. So they move from there to the limitations of scientific research. And I think at that point we'll have a little break and get on with that one. So I think that I've just been challenged. When I talk about books like Chariots of the Gods or whatever it was, of course I said at that time, I don't believe his proof was valid. But my point about it is that it opens people's minds up. We have to make the judgment when we read a book like that, as individual human beings. We have to make the judgment whether we believe in what he said or whether we don't. But the fact is that he opened people's minds up. He made people think about the possibility of life outside of this planet. That's the important thing. The book is up to you to judge, up to me to judge. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's not right to just condemn people who produce. Whatever, he made a lot of money out of his books in the end, but the fact is that he did have a bee in his bonnet about this relationship between certain evidence, which could be evidence, that this planet had been visited by others from space in the past, okay? Whether you believe that or not is up to you, but the point is it makes you think about it. So I don't condemn him. Okay, if he made a lot of money, that's his business, not my business. If in order to make his case more strong, he was carried away and said things which weren't quite accurate in the end, okay, that's his business. But the point is it opens people's minds up. We're not talking about making final decisions about such a matter, because probably there's nothing that's going to produce the evidence in the end that is absolutely concrete. That's my point. That's why I didn't like people deriding the little chap from Barbados who was talking about UFOs. There are a lot of people who say that's all baloney. And I think most of the reports are baloney, but it's just possible It's just possible that it could be so. Do you see what I'm getting at? I hope I'm being clear on this.